The antiseptic smell of Madigan Army Medical Center hung heavy in the pre-dawn air as 74-year-old William "Bill" Patterson pushed his supply cart down the sterile corridors of the emergency department. His weathered face, carved deep by decades of Washington state rain and experiences that nobody in this hospital had ever bothered to ask about, remained focused on his methodical work despite the slight tremor in his hands that came with age. The faded red work shirt he wore daily hung loose on his lean frame, the fabric soft from countless washings and permanently marked by honest sweat stains, paired with blue jeans worn thin at the knees and brown work boots that had lost their shine years ago. His neatly trimmed white beard caught the fluorescent light as he restocked supply cabinets with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that lives depended on having the right equipment in the right place at the right time. To the young Army medics and medical staff at Madigan, Bill was simply part of the infrastructure. Invisible support personnel who kept supplies stocked and floors clean while real medical professionals saved lives and earned recognition. He'd been working as a medical orderly at the facility for 9 years since his retirement, and the bright young medics saw him as nothing more than the old supply guy, with outdated knowledge and shaky hands who belonged in a different era of medicine. Staff Sergeant Maria, Doc Rodriguez, 28 years old and fresh from completing her advanced medical training, strode through the emergency department with the confident swagger of someone who had mastered the latest trauma protocol. Her crisp ACUs bore the distinctive caduceus of the Army Medical Service Corps, and her bearing radiated the kind of professional authority that came with saving lives in field hospitals across Afghanistan. Around her walked 4 other medics, their conversation focused on new equipment and cutting-edge techniques with the casual precision of people who lived on the razor's edge between life and death. Morning had started like any other, with Rodriguez conducting training scenarios in the trauma bay using high-fidelity mannequins and state-of-the-art equipment. Her team gathered around as she demonstrated the latest tactical combat casualty care protocols, their faces showing the intense focus of professionals who took their craft seriously. "Remember," Rodriguez emphasized, adjusting a pressure dressing with practiced efficiency, "speed and precision are everything. Every second counts when you're dealing with arterial bleeding." As Bill methodically organized trauma supplies nearby, Sergeant First Class David "Patch" Thompson noticed him struggling slightly with a heavy box of hemostats, his aged hands trembling with the effort. "Hey, Doc," Thompson called out with theatrical concern, "maybe we should help Grandpa there before he drops our expensive equipment all over the floor." The comment drew chuckles from the assembled medics, their attention shifting from the training scenario to what they saw as harmless entertainment. Rodriguez looked over at Bill, her expression shifting to the kind of condescending amusement reserved for well-meaning but incompetent civilians. "Morning, Bill," she called out, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure her team could hear every word. "How's the supply management going? Hope you're not reorganizing our trauma protocols along with the bandages." The laughter was immediate and familiar, echoing through the sterile corridors. Bill looked up from his inventory, steel-gray eyes meeting Rodriguez's with the calm steadiness that had unnerved better medical professionals than these young soldiers. "Morning, Staff Sergeant," he replied, his voice a low gravel rumble weathered by decades of use. "Just making sure everything's where you need it when you need it. Trauma Bay 3 was running low on combat gauze, restocked that this morning." Specialist Jennifer Needle Chen stepped forward with obvious condescension, her voice dripping with the dismissive tone of youth addressing irrelevant age. "That's sweet, Bill, but we've got inventory management systems for that now. Computer tracking, automated reorder points, modern technology. Maybe leave the medical supply logistics to people who understand current protocols." The mockery grew sharper as more medical personnel drifted over to witness what they saw as an amusing morning distraction. Bill's weathered hands remained steady on his clipboard despite their tremor, his expression unchanged as he continued his methodical work, completely unaware that his quiet competence was about to collide with their arrogant assumptions in ways that would forever change how they viewed experience versus education. The harassment escalated dramatically when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez decided to turn medical training into public entertainment at Bill's expense. She had set up an elaborate trauma simulation in the main training bay, using the hospital's most advanced mannequins and cutting-edge hemostatic agents. A team of medics gathered around the scenario with professional intensity, their ACUs bearing the caduceus that represented years of formal medical training. Scenario: IED blast, multiple casualties with massive arterial hemorrhage, Rodriguez announced with theatrical authority, ensuring her voice carried to the growing crowd of medical personnel. We're going to demonstrate proper tactical combat casualty care using current evidence-based protocols. The training began with military precision, IV lines, pressure dressings, airway management, all executed according to the latest techniques learned in sterile classrooms. But as the simulation progressed, complications arose that weren't covered in their textbooks. The mannequin representing the primary casualty began bleeding through their pressure dressings, simulating the kind of femoral arterial hemorrhage that could kill in minutes. Rodriguez's team struggled with the synthetic blood system, their expensive hemostatic agents failing to control the simulated bleeding as the scenario's computer program escalated the crisis beyond their training parameters. "Damn it," Rodriguez muttered, sweat beading on her forehead as she applied a third pressure dressing that immediately soaked through with artificial blood. "This thing's not responding to standard TCCC protocols." Specialist Chen frantically consulted her field manual while Sergeant Thompson tried different combinations of modern clotting agents, their confidence evaporating as the simulation spiraled out of control. From across the trauma bay, Bill watched the struggling medics with growing concern. His steel-gray eyes, trained by decades of experience, recognized the problem immediately. They were fighting the bleeding instead of understanding it, applying textbook solutions to a situation that demanded improvisation and field craft that couldn't be taught in a classroom. "Staff Sergeant," Bill said quietly, approaching the training area with his supply cart, "that kind of arterial bleeding won't respond to pressure points alone. You need to compress the vessel proximally while packing the wound cavity with plain gauze, not the fancy stuff. Sometimes the old methods work when the new technology fails." The suggestion hung in the sterile air like smoke from a distant battlefield. Rodriguez looked up from her failing attempts, her face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. The presence of civilian medical staff watching their struggle made the situation even more humiliating. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her voice sharp with indignation. "Did the supply clerk just try to give me medical advice?" She stood up, her ACUs bearing the caduceus that represented years of formal training, and faced Bill with undisguised contempt. "Listen, old man, I've got advanced trauma life support certification, tactical combat casualty care instructor credentials, and 3 diplomas worth of experience. I think I know a little more about hemorrhage control than someone who stocks bandages and mops floors." The crowd of medical personnel that had gathered to watch the training scenario now turned their attention to what promised to be far more entertaining: the humiliation of an elderly orderly who had overstepped his bounds. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward with malicious glee. "Yeah, Bill, what's next? Gonna show us how they did surgery in Vietnam, maybe some Civil War amputation techniques." Mockery grew sharper as more staff joined the assault. "I heard he was telling war stories again," Chen called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What was it this time, Bill? Single-handedly saving an entire platoon with a Band-Aid and good intentions." The laughter was cruel and immediate, echoing through the trauma bay. Bill's weathered hands remained steady on his cart handle despite the verbal bombardment, his steel-gray eyes holding a depth that none of them could understand. The fluorescent lights and sterile environment began to warp and fade around him, replaced by the humid heat and acrid smoke of a different kind of medical emergency. In a place where the difference between life and death was measured not in sophisticated equipment, but in steady hands under impossible pressure. It was April 1971, and Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class William Patterson was crouched in a shell crater outside Firebase Charlie. his hands slick with blood as he worked on a young Marine who'd taken shrapnel from a mortar round. The kid, barely 19, from some small town in Kansas, was bleeding out from a severed femoral artery, and Bill's medical kit contained nothing but basic field dressings, morphine, and the kind of improvised solutions that kept men alive when the textbook answers weren't enough. "Doc, I can't feel my leg," the Marine whispered, his young face pale with shock and blood loss. The standard pressure points weren't working. The shrapnel had torn through tissue in ways that defied medical school diagrams. Bill could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery, knew they had maybe 2 minutes before the position became untenable. Without hesitation, he packed the wound cavity with strips torn from his own undershirt, applied pressure with his knee while maintaining the IV line, and used his web belt as an improvised tourniquet when the regulation equipment failed. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't by the book, but it worked. The bleeding stopped, the Marine lived, and they both made it to the helicopter that evacuated them under fire. The memory dissolved as Rodriguez's voice cut through the antiseptic air. "Are you even listening, old man?" She snarled. "What makes you think you know more about trauma medicine than trained Army medics?" From the doorway, Captain Michael Torres, the ER charge nurse with tired eyes and a combat medical badge on his chest, had been watching the exchange with growing recognition. Something about the old man's bearing, his specific medical terminology, his way of assessing the situation before the patient, scratched at a memory from an old deployment roster. Patterson, W.R., Hospital Corpsman, 1st Marine Division. The harassment reached its crescendo when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez decided to transform Bill's humiliation into a department-wide teaching moment. She called over additional personnel, nurses, technicians, medical students, even visiting residents, turning the trauma bay into an amphitheater for what she saw as a necessary lesson in respecting professional boundaries. "Everyone gather around," Rodriguez announced with theatrical authority, her voice echoing through the sterile corridors. "We're about to witness why civilian orderlies shouldn't attempt to practice medicine without proper credentials." The crowd swelled to over 30 medical professionals, their phones openly recording what they expected to be prime social media content. The takedown of an elderly man who had forgotten his place in the hospital hierarchy. Specialist Chen held her phone prominently, framing Bill for her followers. "This is perfect content," she announced. "Some confused old guy trying to lecture actual Army medics about trauma medicine. #stolen valor. #delusional civilian." Rodriguez positioned herself like a prosecutor, preparing closing arguments, her ACUs bearing the caduceus that represented years of formal medical education. "Bill here thinks his decades of stocking supplies qualifies him to override trained medical professionals," she continued, gesturing dismissively at the old man who remained calm beside his supply cart. "He wants to teach us old-school methods, because apparently our evidence-based protocols aren't good enough." The breaking point came when Rodriguez issued her ultimatum. "That's it, Bill. You're done offering medical input in my department. Step away from the training area, or I'll have you removed from this facility entirely and report you for practicing medicine without a license." The threat hung in the antiseptic air like smoke from a distant battlefield. Bill's weathered hands remained steady on his cart handle despite the verbal bombardment, his steel-gray eyes holding a depth that none of them could understand. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise, "that simulated femoral bleed is still active because you're treating the symptom, not the source. Simple digital pressure to the inguinal crease, combined with proper wound packing, would stop that hemorrhage in seconds." The specific medical terminology and tactical precision of his response sent a chill through Captain Michael Torres, who had been watching from the doorway with growing recognition. At 42, with 18 years of military medical service, Torres had worked alongside legendary corpsmen whose names were whispered with reverence in medical circles. The way Bill assessed the situation, his unconscious triage instincts, his bearing under pressure, it all triggered a specific memory from an old deployment roster. Patterson, W.R., Hospital Corpsman, 1st Marine Division. Torres stepped away from the crowd and pulled out his secure phone, scrolling to a contact he rarely used, the direct line to Colonel Eleanor Vance, Chief of Medical Services. "This is Vance," came the crisp professional response. "Colonel, this is Captain Torres in the ER. I need you in the trauma bay immediately. We have a critical situation involving our orderly William Patterson and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez." Torres' voice was tight with barely controlled urgency. "Colonel, I believe William Patterson is Hospital Corpsman First Class William Doc Patterson, Navy Cross recipient, 1st Marine Division, Vietnam." The silence on the other end was immediate and absolute. Every military medical professional knew that name represented something sacred. The legendary corpsman who had brought advanced trauma care to the bloodiest battlefields, often under direct fire. "Are you certain, Captain?" Vance's voice had lost all traces of routine authority, replaced by sharp, breathless urgency. "The bearing, the specific medical knowledge, the scars around his temple and forearm," Torres replied, watching as Rodriguez prepared for her final assault. "Colonel, if I'm right, we're witnessing the public humiliation of a living legend." Meanwhile, Master Sergeant Lisa Washington, the hospital's senior enlisted medical NCO, had been observing from the pharmacy doorway with growing alarm. Her 4 combat deployments as a flight medic had taught her to recognize the signs of true combat medical experience. She pulled out her military phone and dialed the medical command, "Sergeant Major." "Sergeant Major, this is Washington at Madigan. We've got a situation with a civilian orderly named William Patterson. Sir, I think this might be the Patterson, the Navy Cross recipient from Vietnam." In her office, Colonel Vance was already accessing restricted databases, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The personnel system showed only basic civilian employment records, but when she accessed the military medical archives, the screen populated with a service record that made her blood run cold. "Navy Cross, HM1 William R. PATTRSON, 1 ST Marine Division, RVN. The citation read, "Under intense enemy fire, repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire to treat and evacuate wounded Marines. Credited with saving the lives of 23 Marines during the siege of Firebase Alpha." The recognition chain was now racing through the highest levels of Madigan Army Medical Center, carried by medical professionals who understood that Rodriguez was about to commit an act of sacrilege against one of the most legendary combat medics in military history. Phones rang in offices throughout the medical complex, awakening memories of heroes thought lost to time and setting in motion a response that would forever change how the young medics viewed the difference between education and hard-won wisdom earned in blood and fire. The sterile corridors of Madigan Army Medical Center suddenly thundered with the sound of urgent footsteps, as the rumble of multiple vehicles cut through the Washington state evening like artillery fire. A convoy of 3 black SUVs bearing Army Medical Command plates roared to a synchronized halt outside the emergency department entrance, followed by the hospital commander's staff car flying the distinctive pennant of a full colonel. The vehicle's doors opened in perfect military precision, disgorging a collection of senior medical officers whose combined presence radiated an authority that could silence an entire medical complex. Colonel Eleanor Vance emerged first, her immaculate ACUs bearing the caduceus and full colonel eagles that commanded instant respect throughout the military medical community. At 52, Vance was a legend in combat medicine, a trauma surgeon who had saved countless lives in field hospitals from Iraq to Afghanistan, her chest bearing ribbons that spoke of operations conducted under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Behind her stepped Command Sergeant Major Patricia Stone, the hospital's senior enlisted medical NCO, and Captain Torres, all radiating the same iron discipline that came with decades of managing complex medical operations under fire. The assembled medical personnel in the trauma bay snapped to rigid attention as the command element entered, their earlier mockery and laughter dying instantly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood frozen in the center of the crowd, her face draining of color as she realized the magnitude of command attention now focused on her harassment of the old orderly. The phones that had been recording Bill's supposed humiliation were hastily pocketed, replaced by the cold realization that their casual cruelty had somehow reached the highest levels of military medical command. Colonel Vance strode directly toward the trauma bay, her gaze sweeping over the cluster of medics, the red-faced Rodriguez, the failed simulation still bleeding on the training table. And finally, the elderly man in the faded red work shirt who stood calmly beside his supply cart, weathered hands methodically organizing trauma supplies with the same precision he'd once used to triage casualties under enemy fire. She approached directly, ignoring the frozen Rodriguez entirely, her boots clicking purposefully on the polished linoleum. She stopped directly in front of Bill, her presence filling the sterile space with an almost palpable energy. The contrast was stark, immaculate military medical authority facing humble service, but in Vance's eyes there was only one figure who commanded true respect. "Mr. Patterson," Vance said, her voice carrying across the silent trauma bay with resonating authority that seemed to vibrate through the hospital's foundations. "I need to ask you directly, are you Hospital Corpsman First Class William Doc Patterson, United States Navy, 1st Marine Division, Vietnam, 1970 to 1972? The question hung in the antiseptic air like smoke from a distant battlefield. Bill's weathered hands stilled on his supply cart, and for a moment something flickered behind his steel-gray eyes, not fear, but the profound weight of memories of wounded Marines, of desperate moments when his hands had been the only thing standing between life and death. He straightened slightly, and despite his age and humble work clothes, his posture held the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once moved through enemy fire to reach the wounded. "Was Colonel," Bill replied quietly, his gravelly voice carrying a weight that made every medic in the trauma bay lean forward. "Long time ago." Colonel Vance's expression shifted from professional inquiry to something approaching reverence. She drew herself to her full height, her back ramrod straight, and rendered a salute so sharp and precise it seemed to cleave the sterile air itself. "Hospital Corpsman First Class Patterson, it is an honor to have you in my medical facility, sir." Bill, startled by the gesture from such senior leadership, slowly straightened and returned the salute with the crisp precision of muscle memory that never forgot. The sight of the Chief of Medical Services saluting the old orderly sent shockwaves through the assembled medical staff, their understanding of reality crashing down around them like falling equipment. Vance held the salute for a long moment before dropping her hand, then turned to face her stunned medical personnel. Her voice, now edged with barely controlled fury, filled every corner of the trauma bay. "Ladies and gentlemen, you stand in the presence of one of the most legendary combat medics in the history of United States military medicine. Hospital Corpsman First Class William Doc Patterson treated wounded Marines under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable, often while under direct enemy fire." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's face went from pale to ashen gray as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. The man she'd been calling incompetent, mocking for his outdated methods, threatening with removal, he was a living legend of combat medicine. "In February 1971, Vance continued, her voice ringing with pride and barely contained rage, then Corpsman Patterson's Marine unit was ambushed during a patrol near Firebase Alpha, and the unit medic was killed in the first volley and multiple Marines were critically wounded. Corpsman Patterson exposed himself to intense enemy fire for over 4 hours, moving between casualty collection points under direct observation by enemy snipers. The trauma bay had grown so quiet that the sound of ventilators and monitoring equipment seemed deafening. Vance's words painted a picture of courage and medical skill that none of these young medics had ever witnessed firsthand. Using nothing but basic field equipment and improvised techniques, including torn clothing as hemostatic packing material when supplies ran out, he treated 23 wounded Marines, performing emergency procedures that saved lives when standard protocols weren't enough. His innovations became standard doctrine throughout the theater of operations. Command Sergeant Major Stone stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, he was awarded the Navy Cross. His call sign, Doc Magic, was earned through actions that are still taught at the Navy's Hospital Corpsman School. His combat medical techniques are required study for every Navy medic who deploys with Marine units. Vance's withering gaze fell on Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. The sterile trauma bay fell silent as Colonel Vance gestured toward the high-fidelity mannequin that continued to bleed. through its expensive hemostatic dressings. The simulation computer's relentless programming defeating every modern technique Rodriguez's team had attempted. "Hospital Corpsman First Class Patterson," she said with profound respect, her voice carrying the weight of absolute command authority. "These medics need to understand the difference between textbook protocols and battlefield reality. Would you honor us by demonstrating what real combat trauma care looks like?" Bill approached the training scenario slowly, his weathered hands steady despite their age-related tremor as he assessed the situation with the systematic precision that had kept Marines alive under impossible conditions. The assembled medical staff of over 30 personnel parted before him like water, their earlier mockery replaced by hushed reverence as they watched the old warrior in his faded red work shirt transform from humble orderly into master instructor. "The problem isn't your equipment or your training," Bill said quietly, his gravelly voice filling the reverent silence as he examined the mannequin with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much. "You're fighting the bleeding instead of understanding it. This femoral arterial hemorrhage won't respond to standard pressure points because the vessel's been compromised proximally." His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, cataloging wound patterns and pressure point effectiveness with the analytical precision of someone who had made such assessments while mortar rounds exploded around him. He knelt beside the training mannequin, his movements economical and purposeful despite his 74 years. "First, direct digital pressure to the inguinal crease. Here," he demonstrated, pressing his gnarled fingers high and deep into the mannequin's groin area. "You're not massaging, you're clamping that artery to the pelvic brim. Feel for the pulse, then compress until it stops." As Rodriguez reluctantly followed his instruction, kneeling beside the mannequin and applying pressure where he indicated, the simulated bleeding slowed dramatically. "Now we pack the wound cavity," Bill continued, reaching past the array of expensive hemostatic agents to grab plain rolled gauze. "Not the fancy stuff, just basic gauze, deep packing all the way to the source. Gauze in, finger follows, over and over until there's no room left." His hands, though marked by age spots and tremor, moved with horrifying efficiency as he demonstrated the technique, pushing gauze into the training wound with steady, relentless rhythm. A high-tech simulation computer registered successful hemorrhage control for the first time that morning, its digital readouts showing stable vital signs as Bill's improvised techniques accomplished what millions of dollars in modern equipment couldn't achieve. The trauma bay was utterly silent, every medic captivated by the raw, unvarnished wisdom of a true master. "This is messy, it's ugly, and it hurts like hell on a real Marine," Bill said, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "But it keeps him breathing long enough to get here." He looked around at the ring of stunned medical professionals. "The books are right, but books can't feel panic. They can't hear the artillery or the screaming. They don't tell you what to do when your fancy equipment fails or gets soaked with mud and blood." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood frozen, her face ashen as she watched the old orderly work. The man she'd mocked for his shaky hands and outdated methods had just solved a problem that had stumped her entire team using nothing but basic supplies and hard-won experience. "Hospital Corpsman Patterson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology I can never adequately make. What I did was inexcusable. I questioned your knowledge, your methods, your right to offer medical advice. If you tell Colonel Vance to end my career tonight, I won't argue." Bill looked at the young medic, seeing not the arrogant soldier who had tormented him, but another medical professional learning hard lessons about humility and the value of experience over education. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, a black and white image of himself as a young corpsman kneeling beside a wounded Marine in a jungle clearing, his hands covered in blood, but his eyes focused with the intensity of someone fighting death itself. "Staff Sergeant," he said gently, placing the photograph in Rodriguez's trembling hands, "I was young once too. Thought I knew everything there was to know about trauma medicine because I'd memorized every protocol. It was an old Navy chief named Murphy who taught me that medicine is an art as much as a science. That sometimes the best equipment is steady hands and a calm mind." His voice grew softer, weighted with memory and loss. "Murphy didn't make it home from Vietnam. killed by a sniper while treating wounded Marines in an open field because he wouldn't leave them behind. I swore that day I'd never let pride override patient care, and I'd never stop learning from anyone willing to teach, regardless of their rank or credentials. Colonel Vance stepped forward, her voice carrying absolute authority. What we will do next is ensure this never happens again. Hospital Corpsman First Class Patterson, I'm offering you the position of Senior Combat Medical Advisor. Your primary duty will be establishing the Patterson Protocol, a new training program integrating foundational combat medical techniques with modern trauma care. Every medic, nurse, physician assistant, and doctor in this facility will learn from your experience. Bill considered for a moment, then nodded slowly, a slight smile touching his weathered features. I'd be honored, Colonel, but I still want to keep my orderly duties. There's something about making sure the right supplies are in the right place when someone needs them. That's important work, too. The transformation that followed was gradual but profound. Rodriguez, facing potential career-ending consequences, was reassigned to the training division where she became Bill's most dedicated student, learning that medical excellence wasn't about following protocols blindly, but about understanding when to break them intelligently. Her team, initially resistant, gradually understood that their casual cruelty had revealed more about their character than Bill's humble service ever could. Within weeks, a new tradition emerged at Madigan Army Medical Center. Every Friday evening, the main conference room would fill with medical personnel as Bill, still wearing his faded red work shirt, blue jeans, and worn boots, shared stories not of personal heroism, but of young Marines facing impossible wounds with nothing but their training and his steady hand. He spoke of Murphy, the chief who taught him that every patient deserved your absolute best, and of the 19-year-old from Kansas who lived, because someone cared enough to improvise when textbook answers weren't sufficient. The hospital, once filled with casual disrespect toward the old orderly, now resonated with respectful greetings of "Good morning, Hospital Corpsman," and the understanding that the greatest medical expertise often walks among us in work clothes, asking for nothing more than the chance to honor the memory of patients who trusted their lives to his hand. The phone videos of Bill's humiliation were deleted, replaced by respectful documentation of training sessions that would educate future generations of medics about the true art of trauma medicine. Someone quietly removed the medical orderly WPATTRSON label from his locker and replaced it with a small, neat sign. Doc PATTRSON, Senior Combat Medical Advisor. 6 months later, during a mass casualty exercise, a young medic fresh from advanced individual training noticed Bill quietly organizing supplies in the background. "Colonel," he asked Vance, "why is the supply guy in our trauma training?" The room fell silent. Every veteran of that November morning turned to stare at the young medic with expressions of disbelief. Vance smiled grimly. "Because, specialist, before any of us were here, men like him were saving lives with less equipment, less backup, and no safety net. And because everyone in this hospital, from the newest medic to me, practices medicine in the shadow of what men like him already paid for in blood." After the exercise, the young medic found his way to the supply room, where Bill sat alone, looking at his old Navy Cross citation framed on his desk, not displayed prominently, but tucked away where only he could see it. "Hospital Corpsman Patterson," he asked quietly, "Sir, could you teach me about combat medicine?" Bill looked at him, then at the citation with its faded words about conspicuous gallantry, and finally back to the medic. He patted the chair beside his desk. "Sit down, son," he said. "It's not really about the medicine. It's about the Marines who trusted me to bring them home. But I'll tell you what I remember about keeping that promise." And in that quiet supply room, as Washington state rain resumed its steady rhythm against the hospital windows, another link was forged in a chain stretching back through the jungle, through the fire, through the wounded. A chain of medics who understood that true healing doesn't announce itself with advanced degrees or sophisticated equipment. It endures, humbly, in faded red shirts and supply rooms, waiting for someone worthy to ask the right questions and listen to the answers that keep the next generation of patients alive. Bill Patterson continued his quiet service, But now he worked among medical professionals who understood that legends don't always live in medical journals or award ceremonies. Sometimes they organize supplies in hospital corridors, checking inventory and restocking trauma bays, carrying a lifetime of life-saving experiences and the profound responsibility of keeping faith with those who trusted their lives to his steady hands and never made it home to tell their own story. The call sign Doc Magic lived on, not in the sterile pages of military medical history, but in the humble service of an old man who still moved through hospital corridors, honoring the memory of Marines who had bled in his arms, and earned the right to be remembered by someone who understood the true cost of the oath to first do no harm.